Richard Skipper celebrates. Every show is a celebration. Each show, Richard delivers the artists you love, showcasing what makes them unique. Never gossipy. The antidote to a sometimes hectic world. Now, here's your host, Richard Skipper.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel, tucked away off the main highway, and as you see, perfectly harmless looking, when in fact, it has now become known as the scene of the crime. This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house, which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking, less innocent than the motel itself. And in this house, the most dire, horrible events took place. Let's go inside. You see, even in daylight, this place still looks a bit sinister. Now, it was at the top of these stairs that the second murder took place. She came out of the door there and met the victim at the top. Of course, in a flash, there was the knife, and in no time, the victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately and hit the floor. It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the well, I won't dwell upon it. Here's the woman's room, still beautifully preserved. And the imprint of her figure on the bed where she used to lay. I think some of her clothes are still in this wardrobe. This young man, you had to feel sorry for him. After all, being dominated by an almost maniacal woman was enough to drive anyone to the extreme of, well, let's go in. Well, I suppose you'd call this his hideaway. His hobby, as you see, was taxidermy. Crow here, an owl there. Now, an important scene took place in this room. There was a private supper here. And, oh, by the way, this picture has great significance because let's go along to cabin number 1. Well, they've cleaned all this up now. Big difference. You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful. And I'll tell you, there's a very important clue was found here. Down there. Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound, and
Happy Halloween, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Richard Skipper Celebrates. I'm all about celebrating artists and their body of worth. Today, we're going to celebrate Alfred Hitchcock. We're going to celebrate one of his most famous films, Psycho, and we're also going to celebrate Stephen Rebello. Stephen Rebello delved into the deep, dark world of Psycho and the history that led up to the film. Very fortunate enough to interview. This is my second interview with Stephen. We sat down and talked on Jacqueline Suzanne's birthday, which was August 20th, to celebrate his book, The Making of the Valley of the Dolls, Dolls, which I highly recommend. And before we jump in, Stephen, I have to say, I think that this was a book, The Making of Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock and The Making of Psycho, that you were destined to write. After all, you are from Fall River, Massachusetts. And if anyone out there doesn't know the reference, look it up.
Yes. Yeah, well, you're not the first person to say that I was destined to write the book. People talk all the time about that Victorian style house, the Second Empire Victorian style house in Psycho, and how terrifying it is. And I see that, except in Fall River, there are a lot of houses like that. And so
I have to tell you, I just went to Provincetown a few weeks ago, and as I was traveling through Fall River, I was thinking of you.
Well, I'm sorry, or thank you.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a section of the city called the Highlands, and there are many Second Empire Victorians that look like that. And of course, speaking of dire incidents, a certain dire incident happened in Fall River many moons ago that has put it on the map, but Google it. It's nice to be back with you.
Nice to be with you as well. I'd like to revisit a story or a few stories that you shared with us the last time, and that was about the fact that you actually met Alfred Hitchcock, and I'd like you to take us back to that as a young boy, and how you were able to make his acquaintance and the relationship that ensued.
Well, I just started calling him up on the phone. I mean, as bold and ridiculous as that sounds, that is what I did. My parents were lovely people who, always thought a cat could look at a king. And so I had no compunction whatsoever about picking up the phone one day and saying, I would like to talk to Alfred Hitchcock. And, he was at the time, as I was growing up, he was at Universal. That was his, home studio after he'd been at Paramount for so many years, his real home. So I just thought, well, if I got to the operator, how old I am, they were they're operators then, who would give you numbers and they would put you through. And so I called him, and as I pieced it together all these years later, I think what the thing was remember in the old days, they used to have, big telephones with all these little buttons on them. And I think they put in a new intercom system, and Mr. Hitchcock just happened to press the wrong or the right button. And there I was on the other end. And we had this really delightful conversation. He did not make me feel like the child that I was. He was, he was just very interested in me and why I was calling him. I was calling him to tell him that I had just read that he was going to do a certain movie, and I didn't think it was but he was going to do a movie based on a certain novel, and I wondered about that choice. I'd always been interested in films, and so. Well, I
was going to ask you. I mean, were there other people in the industry that you did the same thing with, or was he the one? Okay.
Yeah. I actually called William Castle, a movie director, who is known for sort of
his own horror films.
Yes, and he did lots of gimmick horror movies, which I just thought were the greatest thing. I mean, I've always loved Ballyhoo, and I've always loved the larger than life kind of gimmick, and
Well, since it is Halloween, I'll share a story with you.
Yeah.
The first time that my parents allowed me to stay, I was 17, and I grew up in the South and in a very rural area. I lived next door to a church, and The Tingler was on one night.
Yeah.
I stayed up to watch The Tingler. I was in the house by myself, and we had this big picture window in our living room. And I looked out, and I see these lights running through the cemetery next to our house. And of course, it freaked me out. So like an idiot child that I was, I ran through the house and turned all the lights off. And I sat there in the dark, and every few minutes I would see this light dance through the cemetery. And then all of a sudden I realized it was every time the cars were passing by, the reflection from the headlights were bouncing off of the tombstones.
Yeah.
But you know, that movie and seeing The Tingler, it just freaked me out being alone that night.
Well, I like that somehow you had your own audience participation gimmick for the film. Since your sofa or your chair didn't tingle like they did they said they did at theaters. I don't really think many of those seats actually tingled, frankly. But that's very cool. You had your own sort of,
was also the master of promotion. And there were a lot of elements, and we'll get to that in a few moments. There were a lot of elements of that type of promotion that Alfred Hitchcock used with promoting the film Psycho.
Yeah, so true.
And I mean, everyone who just watched it, very interesting. There are no scenes from the movie Psycho in that trailer.
No, including... That is not anything from the shower scene at the end of the trailer, because that's Vera Miles and not Janet Leigh, for one thing. But no, I mean, like Citizen Kane, there are absolutely no moments from the movie. And it was, that's a very ingenious trailer and a very tough act to follow, by the way, because it's so beautifully constructed and it's so full of fun and tease and exactly the spirit that you're talking about.
And also a few of the elements of his own TV series, which was very popular at the time.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, when you set out to write this book, did you set out to write a book specifically about Psycho, or were you going to write a book about Alfred Hitchcock?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I wanted to write about Psycho because I felt like it was, at the time, it was actually it was an underrepresented movie. It was an undervalued movie. In fact, when I made the pitch and the proposal, there were so many editors who said to me, "Well, clearly you're a very strong writer. Why this one though? Why this? Really?" And a lot of those editors turned the book down, by the way, and regretted it later, but or didn't. I mean, like with Valley of the Dolls, I felt that there was a story to be told there. I felt that there were interesting people involved, and I felt that it was a real one-off for Hitchcock and for Janet Leigh and for Joe Stefano, who wrote the screenplay. And I just felt like there was a story there. Also, I guess it was the first Hitchcock movie that got under my skin. I mean, I had seen Hitchcock movies with my parents, hence the phone call. "Hello, Mr. Hitchcock. This is Stephen Rebello." And I really liked them. My dad was tall and gangly, and he reminded me a little bit of James Stewart. My mother had a beautiful voice, and she was blonde, and I fantasized them as sort of a Doris Day and James Stewart. And I remember they took, they didn't take me, but I was in the car. There was a reissue, I think, of the movie The Man Who Knew Too Much. And I felt like I looked a little like, and everyone used to tell me that I looked a little like the boy in the movie. And I was in the back seat at the drive-in, and the idea of a child taken from his parents, it was horrifying to me. And so, that was my sort of my entry drug. But Psycho was the one that I was. I wasn't old enough to see it. I had to sneak in to see it. And I got.
Well, I was going to ask you. I want you to take us back to that. The first time that you saw Psycho and the circumstances that surrounded that, because just to get a feel Now it's such a part of our consciousness.
Mhm.
But there was a time where it wasn't a part of everyone's consciousness. And I
No.
want to talk about the road that led to that. So let's go back to the first time that you saw Psycho.
Yeah. Well, it was in Fall River, Massachusetts. Fall River is getting a lot of play today on this show.
Yeah.
And there was a wonderful old movie palace called the Durfee then. And it had sunken fish tanks and pink marble. And it had just started to go to seed, I would say, in those days. And so it was a
perfect place to see a movie like this.
Perfect. Just the perfect place to see a movie like this. And in case you haven't figured it out, I was a little bit of a pushy kid in that I didn't really see any barriers or boundaries. I just pushed forward and did whatever I had to do. None of my friends were allowed to see the movie. I wasn't allowed to see the movie. The Catholic Legion of Decency was condemning the movie. We were Catholic. We would go to church and we would hear the movies that we shouldn't go see that week or that year or that lifetime. And those were the movies, of course, that I wanted to see immediately. And so, I just sneaked in. I went after school one day and I took a bus and called my mom and said I was going to see a movie without being specific. And of course she knew, but she was so wonderful and so cool.
And had your parents seen the film?
They had not at that point, although I had a really remarkable experience. My mom had a really great close friend named Betty with whom she worked. I remember this moment all my life. And they were going that night, and they had gone that night to see a Ross Hunter movie. Again, Google it if you don't know. You're missing something.
Completely opposite.
Yeah, well, in a way. And so on the way home, again, I was in the back seat. I'd gone because what my mother used to do is we were very poor, but if she saw Susan Hayward or if she saw, Lana Turner or someone in one of the Ross Hunter movies, within 2 weeks she would have sewn a very close proximity outfit, and that's what she would wear to church on Sunday, and the whole congregation would turn around because she was very beautiful and very charismatic. So anyway, Betty and my mom are driving home, and my mom is driving, and I'm in the back seat, and Betty thinks I'm asleep, so she leans over to my mother and says, "You better not go see Psycho." And my mom's, because Betty had seen it with her husband, Henry. And my mom said, "Why?" And she sort of did it in a stage whisper. So I knew she knew I was awake. And she said, "It's about a queer." That's all I needed. First of all, it was so ignorant. It's not about a queer, but it was a cue that I had to see that movie because it was, I don't think I was even sure what she meant, but I knew it was something
titillating,
at very least. But that story has always stayed with me because it's really indicative of how people misunderstood that movie.
Well, I watched the movie Hitchcock last night, and there's that reference is in the film. So does that come from you? I'm guessing that's coming from you.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, I wrote that scene. But the part of it that really intrigued me years later when I wrote about 4 of the screenplays for Psycho was that up for the Hitchcock movie about Psycho was that's one of the reasons that Anthony Perkins did not get an Oscar nomination, because he was perceived as troubled, difficult on the set, which he was. But it was that queer thing that threw people. And if the movie had not made so much money, it would have been tarred and feathered with that brush as something unclean. And but anyway, I found that fascinating. But I'm dodging your question. So yes, so after school I got to see Psycho, and I was shocked by how many people were in the theater. I mean, there were a lot of people, and you had to line up because you couldn't. They were.
And were there people at the movie that you knew?
You mean in the line?
You're from your town that you lived in, or?
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
including a school teacher of mine. More about her in a moment. But anyway, there were loudspeakers in the lobbies, and Hitchcock's voice was talking about apologizing for lining up, but lining up Bill's character. I mean, it's hilarious. Already, it was like P.T. Barnum. You were being brought into this world in this show. They had the Durfee had big standee displays of Hitchcock with, the exact times. You will not be admitted, after the movie started. And, they didn't allow people in. There was a Pinkerton man at the door. I don't know how I got in because I was not supposed, anyway, I was not supposed to, but obviously destiny said I was supposed to. All I can say to you, Richard, about what happened in that theater is that I was never the same. I've never, ever experienced that kind of pandemonium in a theater. It was mostly adults, obviously. It was not children. And it was.
Again, I was watching Hitchcock the other night, and I'm just laughing out loud. That moment in the film of the montage of the reactions of the audience and Hitchcock walking back and forth outside the theater. Brilliant moment in the film, and it just captures that moment in time because this type of film had never been made before.
Never. And it certainly hadn't been made by Hitchcock, who made movies with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. And
I'm going to go here in a few moments because I've got a trajectory that I want to go on. First of all, I want to go back to 1957.
Okay.
I think that was the right year. And I've got a photograph here that I'll share with everyone. And of course, this is Ed Gein, which essentially is the novel was based on these experiences that were coming out. For those who haven't read the book, can you give us a little background on who this man was?
Ed Gein was, how would we put it politely? Well, he was a loner. He was considered the town oddity. He lived in Wisconsin in a small town. He lived on basically an abandoned farm, his family's farm. He was extremely dutiful toward his mother, who was a formidable presence, Bible toting and a strict disciplinarian. And he had this hobby of taxidermy. He killed, and I hate this, talking about this, but he killed animals, and he stuffed them and had them on display, and then as some people do, he graduated to killing women, and he would because he knew about taxidermy and he knew about preserving body parts and skin and organs and things like that. As one does, he started collecting remains. He and a friend were grave robbers, and again, it's 1957, and these things aren't supposed to happen, and people don't talk about them. But this did get talked about. It was in Life magazine and the big magazines of the day. But even then, if you read the details, they were circumspect. They kept things a little undercover, which was, it was kind of the mode of the Eisenhower and, before the Truman and all of that, those eras. There were things that should not be spoken of. But Robert Bloch, who lived in Wisconsin, devotee of Lovecraft and, the great science fiction and horror writers, Derleth and many others, Ambrose Bierce. This was kind of music to his ears. He started hearing about this stuff. And then, and he concocted a novel, a little, very much, based on Gein, based on another magazine writer that he knew who was obsessed with his mother. So he blended these two figures into the character of Norman Bates. But as you know, and many people know who've read the novel, the Bates of the novel is a terrific novel, by the way. It's a real page turner.
And really ahead of its time. I mean, again, this type of a story, and and you also an inner sanctum mystery.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, in the great tradition of the radio drama, or Inner Sanctum, which my dad used to tell me about all the time, and he would imitate the introduction. I mean, I can hear him at this moment. And so, one knew that was a brand before we called things brands. Inner Sanctum was your gateway to the macabre, the mysterious, whether it was the radio or TV show, and then it became an imprint with a publishing imprint. And so, viewers and readers and listeners knew what to expect. But as you're pointing out, Richard, even those people who read these kinds of books, there was not this kind of book.
There weren't slasher movies, which are commonplace now. Any of this, and that does take us back to what you were starting to say. Alfred Hitchcock, at this time, North by Northwest, big film. It was, and those kind of Technicolor movies.
Mm-hmm.
Alfred Hitchcock was 59 years old.
Yeah,
he was looking for a completely different way of presenting not only film but himself, and then take us back to this book and the response, which is covered brilliantly in your book, to how everyone reacted to the idea that he was going to do this kind of a film.
It was an affront to everyone around him. As you said, he was 59. He knew the game in Hollywood. They tell you what you are. They expect you to continue to be that. And he did not want to be boxed, and he did not want to be gold watched. He wanted.
Now, you go into detail in the book. He had a salary, from the studios, and they wanted to keep him in that little box.
They did, and he refused. Rebel that he was, and the people who beat the bushes trying to find material for Hitchcock. I've spoken with many of them. They were utterly frustrated because they always thought they knew what it is that would inspire him or intrigue him or excite and turn him on. They could almost never figure it out. But this one. There was a review in the New York Times. Anthony Boucher, smart, respected, very smart guy whom Hitchcock trusted. And this one really rang a bell because it seemed the same but very different. It seemed like it would skew younger audiences. It would perhaps appeal to those who were going to William Castle movies and movies being made by American International and Allied artists, where the material was a little more raw, a little more bold. Because, when you're making a very low budget movie, really nobody's watching. You don't have the big studio saying, well, you can't do that or you can't do this. And Hitchcock thought, well, let me take a page from that. And so when he was under contract to Paramount, and as he said, he had just made, North by Northwest and Vertigo and these gorgeous and beautiful movies that promised thrills, but like it was a little safe roller coaster. You're going to be fine at the end. You didn't want to go there anymore, not with this one. And he presented this as a fait accompli. This is my next movie. It's not like I'm asking you. This is my next movie. And they were
his own money up to do this.
Yes, he had to, because basically the people at Paramount were saying, we may release it, but we're not going to.
And all to take the audience back to this time frame. I mean, we live in a completely different time now. There were restrictions in Hollywood on the kind of films that you would make. And got around all of that.
Yeah. Well, look, we're talking about an era in which, you couldn't show a married couple in bed. They had to have separate beds. There were all sorts of
one foot had to be on the floor.
Right. That's right. I know it. I know it all sounds absurd now, but it also there's some. I mean, as a writer, I know when you're working with real restrictions, it sometimes frees you up to be smarter, more clever, more devious, more subterranean, and that's what Hitchcock did. So he persevered. He put up his own money. He and Alma, his wife, and his creative partner in everything, brilliant, absolutely brilliant woman. She wasn't thrilled about it. She came to, "Are you sure, Hitch? Are you sure? Why? Why this one?" That's why I wrote that scene with Helen Mirren and Anthony Hopkins.
Brilliant.
Why this one? And Hitchcock has to explain that they're not going to be watching me with this one. If we put up our own money, they can't tell us what to do.
We had everything. I mean, he had 47 films behind him.
Yeah.
He risked everything that his reputation, his home, everything for the sake of getting this film made. And also take the audience to what the press was like leading up to casting choices and everything. You mentioned Anthony Hopkins, but there were other choices that were bandied around as well.
For playing Norman?
Yes, I
mean, the thing was, what Hitchcock told Joseph Stefano, who was, a young, hip screenwriter, basically untested in many ways, and a complicated guy. He was in therapy and he had mother issues. An interesting kind of combination for that. There was much more of that in the screenplay that didn't get filmed. In any case, what Hitchcock told Mr. Stefano was that, look, it's not going to be like the book in one very key aspect. I'm going to get Anthony Hopkins. I keep doing that. Anthony Perkins to play Norman Bates, and suddenly it became interesting because a younger guy, nice-looking guy, an actor who at that time had a reputation of, and the studio Paramount was building him up as the next James Dean, kind of a troubled youth, but basically a good guy, but clearly with kind of dark, complicated impulses. That seemed like good casting. That seemed interesting. But, Joe Stefano was like everybody else in Hollywood. Oh, wait, I want to write The Man Who Knew Too Much. I want to write North by Northwest. I want to write Notorious. But Hitch pushed him to get dark, get under the surface of this, be funny, be witty, and let's bite the censors on the nose, and let's give the audience a kind of titillation that they have not really had before. So, they went in for the dark stuff. They were determined to show a toilet on screen. Oh, look at that.
Yeah. Those eyes.
Look at that, boy. Yeah, so I mean, when you look
excuse me, but everything you need to know about Norman Bates is in that photograph.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, and you see that photograph and you go, well, maybe some of the other actors that he talked about, talked about possibly Dennis Weaver, possibly even possibly one of the Hickmans at one point. He talked about, Dean Stockwell.
Mm-hmm.
You can begin to see Dean Stockwell. That kind of makes sense. But once they
Roddy McDowall.
Yes, Roddy McDowall. But all of them seemed obvious to Hitchcock. They seemed, because some of them had done some things. Stockwell had done Compulsion, and there were things that and Sons and Lovers, and maybe. No, that's not true. But anyway, there were things about their past resume that said you needed this to be a surprise. So he thought Perkins would be a surprise, and then there were the women that he looked at. I mean, what about Lana Turner? Because again, he was looking for someone who was a star, who was going to disappear from the film pretty early on. So
let's talk about this, and this is a spoiler alert. So if anyone out there hasn't, because something happened in this film that had never happened in the first 30 minutes of the film.
Never.
And the star of the film is brutally murdered.
Yeah. And so he felt they needed, for maximum shock value, to really rock the audience. They wanted someone who is well-known, likable, ladylike, a real presence, someone, this is really key. Mr. Hitchcock kept saying this again and again. He wanted people who were not identified with this kind of picture. It was always surprise them. Don't cast, don't write, don't set direct, don't do anything that is a cliche. Let's avoid the cliche at all possible. And that was the right, I think it was a brilliant road to take. But
well, again, I mean, tell the audience the type of films that we're talking. Janet Leigh got the role,
Sure.
And here, this is the type of image that she had.
Yeah.
I think this picture sums up the kind of roles that she was playing and everything. Wholesome girl next door type, discovered by Norma Shearer. Just completely not what you. And we learn in the first moments that we see her who she is and what she's all about.
Yes. Yeah. The opening scene of the movie was, again, a shocker. This doesn't happen in American movies. And what does happen? A secretary who is aging and unhappy with that, not sure where her life is going, is basically shacking up during her lunch break with her lover, who is in the throes of a divorce. She's in a bra and slip. He is shirtless. Their bodies are together. Hitchcock was rubbing his hands together with glee.
I was going to ask, I can only imagine also, as much as he was rubbing his hands with glee, the constant stress that must have hung over his head.
Absolutely.
Day to day. Will this film ever get, let's say the film gets finished, will it ever see the light of day? Because there were so many boundaries that were being the expression snatched away.
That's right. No, this was this was a scorch the earth kind of movie. And Janet Leigh, with whom I traveled, just a lovely person. It's odd. She was fine. She never had any. She just trusted Hitchcock so implicitly that she knew that she was pushing barriers, that this was going to be a sexy scene, that people would talk about it, but she was eager for it. She wanted to be known as an actor, not just, the wife of Tony Curtis, another, big Hollywood heartthrob, whom she asked Hitchcock to consider for Psycho, and he kind of laughed. She told me how when they were shooting the scene, the opening scene in the hotel room, the lunchtime tryst, there were male crew members hanging from the rafters, looking down. She said, she told me how it just occurred to her when she looked up that this was a big deal. That to her it was, look, Hitchcock is going to cut this in such a way that it will, it'll be
She was a mom.
It'll be sexy, but it'll also be discreet. That was his style. His style was always about show less, imply more, and so she trusted that, and in fact he did do that. But it is a sexy scene, and he told me to my face. I know that he said this to Truffaut as well. but he said that the scene was marred because she shouldn't be wearing a bra and her breasts should be rubbing against. I have to say this. He said her breasts should be rubbing against what's his name's chest, and I said, "Oh, you mean John Gavin?" He said, "Well,
John Gavin.
On the set, I called him Rock." Because Rock Hudson was one of the people that he considered to play Sam Loomis, and he would do that. He didn't like John Gavin at all. He thought he was a terrible actor, and he didn't know his lines. And poor John Gavin only seemed to want to please him, and nothing he could do would please him. Hitchcock did do that with men, though. There were certain very good-looking actors that he was rough on. He wished.
Now, I know
he wished to look like that. You know?
I want to talk a moment about this intense relationship that he had with Vera Miles and bringing her into the film, and this takes us back to when he was working on the film Vertigo.
Yes.
Can you take our audience there and then bring us up to where we are in the story?
Sure. Well, one of the big disappointments in Mr. Hitchcock's career was the loss of Grace Kelly. He adored her. She adored him. They loved working together, and they made successful movies together. And he hoped that would go on forever. We know that she fell in love and became a princess and became, kind of untouchable as far as Hollywood was concerned. But they always kept in touch, and he loved her. But he. We think it's easy, but has there been a Grace Kelly since? That comes along once in a lifetime. Mm-hmm. But that was, whether it was Ingrid Bergman or Madeline Carroll in another era, or Grace Kelly, those were, they were impeccable screen presences and beautiful, and they could act. So. What do you do if that is your ideal of a woman on screen? You try to find another one. And, Vera Miles had been under contract at several studios. He saw great potential in her at the time when he, first spotted her. She just ravishing looking, just fresh-faced and really beautiful, and maybe one of the better actors he'd ever had the chance to work with. And he put her under contract, and she was mystified. She liked him very much. They liked each other, but she couldn't understand how she fit into, the mold of the Hitchcock blonde. She was more outdoorsy. She was a much more direct kind of person, earthy kind of person. But he put her under contract, and he did what he did with Joan Fontaine and many of the women, including Grace Kelly. He groomed her to be the ideal Hitchcock heroine. He got Edith Head working on clothing, costume. He brought in specialists for hair, makeup, and if you see the color tests that he did for Vertigo, they're pretty stunning, actually. So he really designed Vertigo as the movie after The Wrong Man, where he first worked with her, and he worked with her on a television program. He thought, I've got the real thing here. And so he designed this whole movie, and Edith Head and Henry Bumstead and the cinematographer. Everything was about Vera and what she would look like and how she would move and all of that. Vera chafed under Hitchcock's, he'd made a big investment. He spent a lot of money and time developing her, and she was ready to do the movie. But in Vera's defense, the movie was postponed many times because of illnesses in the Hitchcock family, troubles with the screenplay, James Stewart's availability. By the time they were ready to shoot, Vera Miles was busy living her own life, married to a gorgeous Tarzan, Gordon Scott, and she was pregnant. And Hitchcock, he was crushed. And when Hitchcock was hurt, he got mean.
Yeah.
And he was not the most direct person. And he would always get intermediaries to tell her, ask Miss Miles to. But that really tore the fabric of their relationship. Talk about a torn curtain. It was a real falling out. And although he had other movies in mind for her, he continued to have her up to the point of Marnie. She was always on the North by Northwest. Even before that, she was always on the list as the possible. But Grace Kelly, since I've seen all those lists, was always number one. Kept hoping that she would come back, and he almost nearly got her back at one point. But anyway, so Vera Miles was now, in his eyes, damaged goods. He told her, when she told him that she was pregnant, he said, "You already have children. Don't you know that, having more children is vulgar?" Terrible thing to say, just a terrible thing to say. But in his world, in his worldview, in his kind of sex is here for him. That's really where it was for him. It was a mental thing that, it was unthinkable. How could anyone want something more than movie stardom? Because, Vertigo was supposed to bring her out as the new girl, the new Grace Kelly, even before Tippi Hedren, the magazines called her the new Grace Kelly. And so it was a very complicated relationship. She didn't dislike him, but she couldn't understand how he could think a personal life would be less important than a career. And for some actors, it is. A career is more important than family, but not to her. And so he could have cast her as Marion in the lead of Psycho, but he didn't. He gave her the subsidiary role of the sister. And that's a really interesting example, because I've never found a still or a moment or an image of Vera Miles on working on Psycho where she's actually looking at Hitchcock or they're looking at each other. It was a tense set. Hitchcock loved Anthony Perkins, loved him. Had a rocky beginning with Janet Leigh. Wondered if she was up to it, but they got along beautifully after that. But with John Gavin and
she really threw herself into the role. I mean, she created an entire history of Marion Crane.
She did. And that was part of her MGM training. She would always write a backstory, and so her. I saw her screenplay. It was filled with perfumes that Marion wore, and music that she would listen to, and what she would make for Sam Loomis, her boyfriend, when he was able to come to. It was beautiful. I mean, it was such. This is why Hitchcock adored her and Anthony Perkins, because
before we do time, we have to get to the shower scene. Yes. Now, that iconic moment in the film, and the incredible scoring that goes behind that, everything, and I remember growing up and hearing people say, well, when they saw it, they saw him actually stab her, which of course you never see in the film. Right. And it's just the brilliance of the way it was cut and everything. And there was also a body double that was brought in to do that scene.
That's right.
Can you take us there for a moment?
Sure. Well, there was, oddly, the shower sequence, although it's the most famous sequence in the film, was not the most difficult. It was the killing of the detective on the stairs. That's the one everyone thought was going to be the money. But the shower sequence required new cutting technique, and he brought in Saul Bass to do, kind of a visual design for it. And he knew it needed to be montage, because in those days you could not show nudity. You could not show a naked breast. You could not show a torso. And so Hitchcock wanted to do a very impressionistic murder where you get little bits of film that cut together would give you the very images and sensations you're talking about. Horror, dread. Yes, I saw that knife go in. I saw blood everywhere. People to this day tell me that sequence was in color. It was the only one in color in the whole movie. But it all speaks to how impactful it was and how it was meticulously designed to be, that powerful. It took about 8 days to film. Hitchcock did not tell Janet Leigh about a body double because Janet Leigh was of the mind, as she should be, as any woman would be. He's not going to show everything. And so, the kind of little modesty covers that they had for her body, and body stocking kind of thing, were, she felt, sufficient, that she was, for all intents and purposes, going to be seen as nude in this, in this sequence. And, everything had to be planned out in terms of lighting, in terms of what do you use for blood? In this case, Bosco chocolate. How do you get, what should the shower look like? How should the water spray? How could we get a camera that would, show the shower head, but not, but show the water going out in a halo? How would you light it? How would you cut it? How would you hide the identity of the murderer? So there were enormous production issues to be dealt with. But for Janet Leigh, it was a performance. It wasn't, I'm taking a shower and I'm going back to Sam and I'm going to make everything all right. It was, she wrote what Marion was thinking and feeling and how she wanted to make restitution for the crime that she committed and what would happen. And she had a real performance mapped out in her mind. And the body of Marley Renfro was a Playboy model and was completely nude on the set. And the crew members would tell me about how one of their favorite memories was Marley, and a lovely woman, by the way, and still with us, and Mr. Hitchcock would be sitting together and she'd be completely nude in the chair and they'd be talking about wine and travel. Sorry?
She was referred to as the nude.
Yes. And it was like, this is so Hitchcockian, really. This is the most normal thing in the world. What are you all going on about?
Now, I will say this, he did wonders for the bathtub industry because people, no one wanted to take a shower again after this.
Well, I think he also helped kill the motel industry too.
We are going to run out of time. I'm gonna have to bring you back for a part 2 to this because it's such. There's just so much to this. But I want to ask you, right after the film opened, there were still moments that were cut out of the film.
Yes,
because of the time frame it was there, and it was just within the last year or so that I guess on the new Blu-ray version of the film that footage has been restored. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Blu-ray's just been out for a couple of months, and it's been a bone of contention for me because the movie that I saw is the movie that you now have on Blu-ray. The movie that my father and mom saw is that movie. That is the way Psycho was released to theaters originally. People called it the German version because, print serviced and was shown on TV in Germany. Nonsense. It's the way the movie was made by Alfred Hitchcock. Local, censorship boards and boards in different cities would cut and cut and cut. When the film eventually was shown on television, much more was cut. And that version is what got on home video. So that cut version is the way many people at least, saw Psycho at all.
Go back to that moment from when it was going to be first shown on television.
Yes.
CBS.
Yes.
Just a few days before it was scheduled to be aired, there was another gruesome murder in the country.
Right.
And CBS didn't think that it was the right time for it to be shown. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was a horrifying murder, and it's still unsolved. By the way, happened in Chicago. Daughter of a politician. Just a horrifying, really horrifying murder. And CBS showed discretion by not showing the movie. But Psycho was never shown on network television. That never happened. They did reschedule it, but that was pulled. You can see old TV guides and old newspaper ads for the film, being announced that it was going to be shown on a certain night. But they just felt that,
And interestingly enough, since it is Halloween,
Yeah.
I remember correctly, the TV guide in which it was advertised, Elizabeth Montgomery is on the cover of the magazine.
That's right, and she was bewitching. That's exactly right. Good on you. That's a good memory. So it was never shown. So it's interesting because people keep saying to me now, "Oh, I like it." When they see the Blu-ray or something, well, it looks great and all that. But I don't know that it needs that extra. It's just because you didn't see it that way. My dad was the one who actually told me, because he said when he saw it on TV, "Where's the extra stabs of the knife with all that?" So a keen eye. I didn't notice it. He told me.
Stephen, again, bravo. I know that you wrote this book several years ago, and in the introduction to this book, you also mentioned that you would love to go back and rewrite huge spots of the book. It is a great book. I highly recommend it. If you look at the scroll, order it on Amazon. I want to thank everyone for being here today. If you enjoyed the show, and I hope you do, and if you haven't done so already, please go to my website, richardskipper.com, sign my guest book with your thoughts about today. And I always end every show by telling everyone to go out and do something nice for somebody else without expecting anything in return. So today I'm going to advise that you go to your Facebook friends list, go to the third name that pops up, and send them a copy of the book. They'll thank you. Stephen will thank you. I'll thank you. And throw in a shower curtain while you're at it. Stephen, before we sign off, I'm going to give you the final word. Any message that you want to put out to everyone, your final thoughts on the book. There's so much that we did not cover, but we can only fit so much into an hour.
Of course.
You are just the best. And what's next for you? Let me ask you that before I turn it to you.
Thanks for asking. Well, it helps in COVID time. We're in a difficult time to at least for me, to focus on the next thing. And I'm working on the new book, which is a departure. It's my Hitchcock Psycho sort of departure, unlike anything I've done before. And yet, being vague about it because it's a new baby. But I can tell you that I'm loving working on it, and I think people are going to enjoy it, and I think it's going to surprise people.
Will you come back when it's ready?
Oh, yes. Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. So I just say, all of you, new challenges. It's interesting, when I first saw Psycho, I was just a kid, and it was a horror movie, and I was thrilled. And now I see it, and I find it very human and unutterably sad in many ways, and a much deeper movie than I ever knew. And that's true for all of us, for everybody that you meet. Be nicer, be kinder, ask questions, especially now.
Thank you. And happy Halloween.
I am going to have a ball. You too. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.